Hello everyone, and welcome back to The Beatles Forever. Today we're going back to the Mal Evans story, and I look forward to finding out more about this man. In the last episode, we saw Mal find a wife, and he got a good job. He bought a home, a car, and had a son. He accomplished so many things in a short amount of time. Then he discovered the Beatles one day playing at the Cavern and became their substitute driver when Neil Aspinall became sick with the flu. And Mal was getting closer to joining up the Beatles full time. So let's see what's going on today. The Beatles started noticing the big man that was frequently showing up at their shows. George said that Mal would send him on the other people and request Elvis songs. After a while, they realized that Mal wanted to hear Elvis songs, and they would say, "Well, now, we'd like to do a request for Mal." And Paul recognized Mal first and foremost was a Presley freak. He took Elvis's monthly all the time. And the Beatles would get to read the newsletter too, because Mal would bring it with him for them to see. One evening, George invited Mal over to his family's home in Speke, a suburb of Liverpool, where they hung out and had dinner and listened to records. George came up with the idea of Mal becoming a bouncer. He said to him, "Look, you're big and ugly enough. Why don't you be a bouncer on the door? You get paid for it. You get in the band room and you meet the bands." The idea of becoming a part-time bouncer in the evening was a great idea for Mal. There was a new baby at home, and he and Lily could use the extra money. George also pointed out the idea of being close to the action and resorted with the music makers himself was simply too enticing for a devoted fan like him to ignore. Mal felt the Beatles were an outfit worth following. The Beatles, in the meantime, had found a manager in 27-year-old Brian Epstein. He was a born businessman, and he had a vision for the Beatles' future. Brian, just like Mal, had discovered the Beatles in the Cavern, and he felt like the Beatles were going to be bigger than Elvis. It was a prediction that the Beatles at the time found absurd. Mal filled the role of bouncer by his large physique. He said, "I was a middle-class bouncer, most of them coming from a much harder school than the one I was brought up in. My idea was to talk people out of trouble before it started. Being an ardent coward helped a lot. Getting punched in the mouth was not my idea of fun," he wrote. So Mal was lucky because he would rarely be called on to work alone at his post outside the club. The Cavern manager, McFall, had a rotating cast of bouncers, including Paddy Delaney, hired back in 1959, and future Olympian Wallace Booth. Booth was a prize-winning wrestler who would later win a silver medal at the Commonwealth Games in Jamaica. Booth enjoyed working at the door. He liked the club's fabulous rock and roll atmosphere. He liked standing at the top of the steps. The Cavern was made of bricks and arches, and you never ever wore good clothes downstairs because the sweat was running down the walls, and if you leaned against the wall, you were in a mess. John Fanning, who managed Ted King-Size Taylor and the Dominoes and a popular Merseyside rock combo, remembered observing Mal as he worked the door, along with two other chaps, just making sure all the boys that came in were going to behave themselves. When things got tight, Fanning recalled, Mal was always very helpful with the guys in the groups that struggled to get their equipment down the stairs into the hot and sweaty Cavern. Mal said that George was right about all he would learn by working as a bouncer, and he remembered the time at the door as a fabulous, giving you a chance to get to know all the musicians because we often helped them hump their gear in and out of the bandwagons. Mal, in his time as a bouncer, didn't have trouble free times all the time. The Cavern had an edgy quality at night. The lunchtime crowd had kids and clerks and secretaries, but by the time the nightfall came, there was blue-collar people there. And one evening in the summer of 1962, Mal was hit by a drunk outside the Cavern. He was an older guy, and he hit Mal with a punch to his jaw, which dislodged a tooth. Mal didn't punch back, but he still made sure the drunk wouldn't get past him and into the basement club, and Mal stood his ground. As the year went on, Mal's bouncing opportunities grew beyond the Cavern. Brian Epstein devoted all his energy to make the Beatles a success. Brian got the Beatles as many gigs as they could perform. In April, Brian succeeded in adding a dose of class to the Beatles act when he convinced them to trade in their leather for suits. In May, he got them a record deal with EMI's Parlophone label, and the band had a recording session set for June 6th with George Martin, who was then 36 years old. Brian at this time started to assemble a team. He invited Mal to serve as head bouncer for the NIMS Enterprises, the business that Epstein had orchestrated to oversee the band's interests. In July, Brian hired 17-year-old Frida Kelly, a Cavern regular, to join Secretary Beryl Adams to handle NIM's growing workload. He also hired 16-year-old Tony Bramwell to serve as his assistant. Mal, being the head bouncer, meant working as the Beatles' bodyguard. As with a part-time job at the Cavern, not to mention his continued employment at GPO, he enjoyed dressing to the nines and assuming his role as a quiet, even dignified professional. Working for NIMS allowed Mal to get more money for the family, but he was also gone a lot, both day and night. At times, Mal could enjoy a rare and much welcome day off. And that day was July. Mal and his family went to the celebration of the Wavertree Mystery, an annual event held to commemorate the anonymous donation of a beloved local playground back in 1895. Mal later recalled that Lil and I were proudly pushing Gary in his pram when she turned to me and said, "There's a weird guy over there who keeps staring at us. Now he looks like a real Cavernite to me." When Mal turned, he saw Paul standing there, unshaven, with a denim jacket thrown over his shoulder and chewing on a toffee apple. Niceties were exchanged, and Mal introduced Paul to Lily. Mal wrote, "We spent the rest of the day together, Paul and I, daring each other to go on things like the parachute drop and other displays that took nerve, neither of us accepting the challenge. And at one point they stopped in front of an automobile exhibition. Paul announced to Mal that one of these days I'm going to own one of these cars," pointing to one very humble saloon sedan-type car. Mal made it up to Lily a few weeks later when they attended the Riverboat Shuffle, a package tour that Cavern owner Ray McFall had booked about the MV Royal Iris. A 3-hour voyage along the Mersey River, the show was headlined by Johnny Kidd and the Pirates, with the Beatles playing second on the bill, followed by a Manchester act, Peter McLean and the Dakotas. Known as the fish and chip boat for its greasy cuisine, the ferry was not for the squeamish. There were hot summer nights when the boat would get hit with choppy cross currents of the Irish Sea. Everybody would be dancing away and the band was playing, and then the first passengers would be off throwing up. That night before the Beatles' riverboat performance, George invited Mal to come down and see them in his dressing room. After the show, Mal introduced Lily to the rest of the band, whom, save for Paul, she was meeting for the first time. On this occasion, Mal later recalled, Lily and I bought fish and chips for the group and ourselves, as they could only muster enough money between them to pay for the teas. Lily wasn't sure about Mal's bouncing gig, but she enjoyed getting to know the Beatles. After gigs, Lily later recalled, George would come back to our house for bacon and eggs. He sometimes came back before Mal to keep me company. I'd be washing baby clothes and nappies or ironing. I liked him the best. Lily fondly remembered the time she pushed the bangs from Harrison's face, saying, "Let's see what it looks like with your hair pulled back." "Let's see what it looks like with your hair back. I like that better." But George wasn't having it. He combed his hair forward, telling her, "That's the way I have to wear it. It's the Beatles cut." So Neil Aspinall at this time had been working for the Beatles since 1961, and he had known them, at least individually, much longer. Neil was born October 1941, and when he was 12, he attended the English and art classes with Paul at the Liverpool Institute. And during this time, he met George behind the Institute's air raid shelters, where they shared cigarettes. Not long afterward, Neil came into John's world while John was attending the Liverpool College of Art. Well, Neil was studying to be an accountant, but he decided not to go that route, and instead started driving the Beatles around in his old Comer van, charging them 5 shillings per gig. He was tall and thin in comparison to Mal Evans, but Neil could handle himself. He had studied martial arts. Neil gained a good friend in Mal, and he helped Neil to negotiate the daily goings-on in the Beatles' increasingly complex lives as new rock and rollers. George said that back then Neil had to do everything. It was hard organizing all the equipment, although there wasn't much, just a drum kit and 3 amplifiers, but there was a lot to get in and out. Packing up, Neil would have to get the equipment, carry it out, open the van, put it in the van, lock the van so it wouldn't get stolen, and then go back in and get the next bit and come back out, open the van, put it in, lock it again. August the 16th, Pete Best was dismissed from the band after being with them for 2 years. He was replaced by veteran Liverpool drummer Ringo Starr, formerly of Roy Storm and the Hurricanes. Pete was blindsided, and so were Mal and Neil. Neil felt like it was a personal blow because he was best friends with Pete. So Brian and the Beatles wondered about their roadies' loyalties, but they need not have worried. Neil later said, "When Pete was sacked, he wanted to drink with me all through the afternoon, but I said, no, I have to drive the van tonight." He said, "But I've just been sacked." And I said, "You've been sacked, Pete. I haven't been sacked. I still have got a job to do." Neil was professional and wasn't going to shirk his duties. The Beatles quickly rewarded him with a raise, increasing his weekly wage to £10. Everyone wondered why Pete was let go, Mal and the cave dwellers, and they heard the rumor mill. Bobby Brown said Pete's sacking was due to his gloomy demeanor, pointing out that, in contrast with Ringo, Pete never smiled. Mal, though, felt the reason was a bit flimsy and there had to be more to it, and he would soon learn he was right. The seeds of Pete's demise had been sown back in June when George Martin expressed displeasure to Brian over the drummer's musical abilities. With an EMI contract in hand, the other Beatles didn't want to risk their future on a drummer that was just fair, and truth be told, they didn't really like him that much anyway. Mal would never forget the night Ringo made his Cavern debut. It was Sunday the 19th, 1962. He was working double duty, manning the door, serving as the Beatles' bodyguard. Mal said, "I was on duty in the Cavern the first night Ringo drummed as a Beatle." Feelings ran high, and the many Pete Best supporters took exception to the change. Girls were sobbing in the Matthews Street about Pete's firing. Others chanted, "Peter forever, Ringo never." Afterwards, George, one of the Ringo's strongest supporters, got a bloody nose during a scrape that occurred out of Mal's sphere of protection. Mal wasn't on hand a few days later when George got another injury. A local Cavernite witnessed the mayhem at the Cavern Club. He said Ringo was looking sheepish and McCartney was hands in the air, sorry, trying to be diplomatic. Lennon couldn't care less, but George was being sarcastic, so he got thumped as he came out for the break by Mickey Flynn, getting a black eye to go along with his wounded nose. Mal, in retrospect, recognized the wisdom in having Ringo in the band. He had heard Pete's lapses with his own ears, and he would notice that Pete would lose tempo at times. Mal thought Ringo brought quality to the Beatles that they had lacked before, and he was the final ingredient to the cake. And that fall, the Beatles' debut single, "Love Me Do," notched a top 20 showing on the UK charts, a clear sign of better things to come. So I'm going to end the video here. In this episode, we got to see Mal work his way up as head bouncer and become close to the Beatles, especially George. Mal wanted to make more money for his family, but he was hardly there at the house. Lily wasn't sure about his bouncer job, but she liked the Beatles. Mal was there at the Cavern, and all the fans that were upset that Pete had been fired and Ringo took over, and I'm sure it was a tense time for everyone there. There were chants of "Peter forever, Ringo never," in tears. George, who was a big supporter of Ringo, got a sock on the nose, and a few days later a punch in the eye for his sarcasm. Mal wasn't close enough to help him out, I guess. He was pulling double duty, working the door and being the Beatles' bodyguard. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated, and it would really help out my channel. I wish everybody a good day, and tune in again soon for the Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.